Hi, welcome today. How are you feeling at the moment? I've been feeling a bit tired recently. I think it's funny that with all this time at home, you'd think we all would feel really rested, but actually I understand for a lot of us, we're feeling quite tired with the COVID threat. It's a bit confusing, and that's what I want to talk about today. Hope in Jesus in a time that's confusing. It's a bit confusing what level 2 is going to be like. Are we going to be able to travel a little bit more? Will we be able to go skiing down at the mountain, or even just a day at Taupo? Will we be able to go and visit more friends, go to the cinema? Lots of questions. I believe that God is wanting to remind us of the story of Daniel in the lion's den today and speak to us out of that story. I love lions. I'm looking forward to going back up to Auckland Zoo and having a look at the lions at some stage. There were lots of lions in the Bible. There were lions that were running loose in Jesus' time, and even more in the time of Daniel. The Middle East has both the Asiatic and the Atlas lion, and fully grown, a male lion can be 230 kgs. That's huge. And more so, they're not the most powerful jaws of a big cat, but a lion's jaws can express 600 pounds per square inch. That's about 4 times more biting ability than we have, certainly enough to crush bones. There are over 100 different references to lions in the Bible. The Messiah, Jesus, is referred to as the Lion of Judah. And Peter warns people that the devil can be like a roaring lion. So there are both positive and negative references to lions. Well, let me tell you the story of Daniel. Daniel was a young man taken away during the exile from Israel to Babylon in about the year 600 BC, and he was enrolled as a leader there. Many cultures have learnt the trick of taking the youngest and brightest men and women of the cultures that they have conquered and enrolling them in their own system, enculturating them so that they become advocates for submission to the dominant culture. And this is what had happened to Daniel. I remember Jodie Clegg's song, A Third World Child, with the words, "Learn to speak a little bit of English. Don't be scared of a suit and tie. Learn to walk in the dreams of a foreigner. I am a third world child." And that's what was planned for Daniel. He was privileged so that he would lead his people into submission. It's very hard for a young person today, and just as much in the past, when surrounded by a culture, not to take on the values of that culture. But Daniel held on to his godly values, even in a different culture. Today I want to suggest that we are being immersed in COVID culture. I'm not talking about some grand conspiracy theory. Just the experience of reacting to COVID all the time is making a difference in our assumptions. I think that we're learning new values, new slogans, and new practices. Stay home, save lives would be an example. And like Daniel, we're being soaked in that culture without really realising it. A culture that in the crisis is good, but when the crisis lifts, we need also to step away from some of it. We are being submerged in a new global COVID culture. We don't shake hands anymore. We don't hug, we don't hongi, we don't kiss. Absolutely fine for the time of the crisis, but let's not perpetuate those too long. It's a bit like the water we're swimming in is becoming salty, or the air we're breathing is becoming more humid, or the soil that we're walking on is becoming compacted. We're being affected by a different culture. Again, let me be clear, there are good things about COVID culture. We're all washing our hands more and we're coughing into our elbows. But COVID culture also isolates people, and we need to put off COVID culture at the right time. When Daniel went to Babylon, he was succeeding there. And then Babylon was conquered by the Medes and Persians, and Daniel started to succeed also in that new culture. But things had changed. You see, the Medes and Persians had a different approach to law. If the king made a bad law, he couldn't change it. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So Daniel was living in a different culture. He was thriving in that culture, but also being faithful to his God, our God. But then some rivals set out to trip him up, and he was faced with the challenge of obeying his culture or being faithful to God. He chose to be faithful to God. We need to be aware that there are always people out there to trip us up. So Daniel's rivals looked for an opportunity to accuse him, but they couldn't. It says they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Daniel 6:4. What a testimony. What a story for a young man that they couldn't find anything wrong with him. And so they had to set him up. So they had observed what he did. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God. At a window in his house that overlooked or looked towards Jerusalem. And they used that as their way to trap him. They went to the king and suggested to the king, let's have a law that for 30 days no one can worship anyone except the king. And the king, flattered, passed that law. And then the rivals trapped out Daniel, because Daniel kept faithfully worshipping God. Daniel was caught out and accused. He doesn't deny it, and the king, even though he doesn't want to carry out the sentence, has no choice but to condemn Daniel. The king wishes Daniel all the best. He honours Daniel for his faith. Verse 16, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. And he throws Daniel in the lion's den. At times, COVID-19 feels a bit like a lion's den. We're all surrounded by a ravenous beast that wants to destroy us. It's interesting, that's how God describes sin to Cain. In Genesis 4:7 he says, But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. I wonder what it must have been like inside the lion's den. Was Daniel afraid? Did the lions come up and sniff him? Did he stand up all night? Or did he approach the lions? Did he stare them down? Or did he just lie down himself? We know that those lions were capable of carnage because they crushed the next group thrown to them. Did they prowl around all night? Did they keep the distance? Or did they come and cuddle up beside him, a lion laying down with the lamb? Whatever happened, we're told that an angel of God closed their mouths and Daniel was safe. In the morning, Daniel came out and proclaimed that God had rescued him, and the king was overjoyed. In fact, it was the king who had had a sleepless night. He was worried for Daniel, and he was so immersed in his culture that he couldn't find a way to rescue him. Daniel was a man of character and of courage, and a great role model for us all. Today I'm wanting to suggest that having hope in Jesus in a time of confusion can give us courage and clarity, not only to fight the virus, but to put off COVID culture when the time is right. To stand against the culture of isolation and self-protection. I want to suggest that there are 4 areas of confusion. How to be faithful to our family and friends in the midst of a bubble of culture. How can we be generous in the midst of scarcity culture? How can we be outreaching in the midst of self-protecting culture? How can we be faithful to God in the midst of compliance culture? Bubble, scarcity, protection and compliance. And I want to suggest a principle that underlies all of this. We should consider putting ourselves at some risk to care for others, but we should avoid putting others at risk to care for ourselves. I think that's the sort of thing that Jesus would have done. Number 1, faithfulness to family and friends. Let's be aware that bubble culture is making us afraid to venture out and connect with people. Let's make sure that that doesn't continue too long after the rules are relaxed. Now, I'm not talking about being foolish, not talking about breaking the rules or having big parties or stupid protests in the streets. I am, however, saying that we need to be aware that COVID culture could contribute to a creeping loneliness. We all need to look out for people needing a visit at a safe distance, with older folk, shut-ins, or our friends living on their own. You know, when we're feeling a bit lonely, we never admit it. We don't even admit it to ourselves. So we need to look out for people and think who might need a visit, even if they don't ask. Let's keep safe distance. Maybe we'll meet outside. Let's not invade each other's space, but let's also not abandon anyone to loneliness. I think we've all heard the horror about folk in Spain who were left on their own to die. Let's fight the unintentional consequences of COVID culture. Let's intentionally look out for our older folk and widows. Give proper recognition to those widows who are in need, Paul says. If a widow has children or grandchildren, put your religion into practice by caring for your own family, for this is pleasing to God. 1 Timothy 5, 3-4. If in the crisis it is stay home, save lives, then in the recovery mode it needs to say stay connected at a safe distance. If we're staying home just for our own protection at the cost of someone else's loneliness, that's not a good thing. Remember that Mother Teresa said that loneliness is the greatest disease of our time. Well, number 2, generosity in a culture of scarcity. COVID-19 has brought us fear of scarcity, a fear about our business or our jobs. As the people of God, we need to live a culture of generosity in little ways and in big ways. We need to continue to make donations to charities, but we also want to buy some food from local cafes, to buy clothes or furniture if we are able. Not to take on consumer debt, but if we have a little cash, to sow it into the local economy. Buy that item we were thinking about buying. Get the plumber in and give her some income. Get the sparky in and give him some work. Don't borrow, but share what we have. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah is living through a time of famine, and he goes and visits a widow at Zarephath. And that widow is about preparing her last meal for her and her son, and Elijah asks her to share that food with him. He promises that God will look after the woman, but the woman shares the food, I think, not just because she believed the promise, but because she had generosity in her heart. And then, with the little that she had, God provided. And the widow and the son and Elijah were fed all the way through the famine. You see, God can take the little we have and use it. It's a bit like the feeding the 5,000. Jesus took the little that a young boy gave him and fed many. In COVID culture, we are tempted to hoard. Let us be generous. Not recommending borrowing money to buy a bigger TV, but being generous with what we have, giving to the poor, spending in the local economy, supporting our tradies, holding on to a culture of generosity. Well, number 3, how can we be outreaching in a culture of self-protection? This is a time, even when we've been stuck in our bubbles, to share faith in Jesus. Not just to hunker down and think only of ourselves, but to overcome our inertia and reach out. Maybe you'd like to share this sermon link with someone. Start a conversation with a relative. Send a text to a friend. Send an email to an acquaintance. Pray for your neighbour. In the New Testament, there was a famine, and Paul went around collecting offerings for Jerusalem. And while he did that, he took the opportunity to share the good news. COVID culture encourages us to keep our heads down and survive, just to ask Jesus to look after us. And it's a good place to start, but gospel culture recognises this is a time to talk about a treasure that cannot be lost in the market, a vitality that even death cannot overcome. Now is the time to invite people to a life-changing encounter with the living God. We can take the time to initiate a deeper conversation with friends. Daniel was faced with a culture that did not worship God, and yet he continued to give thanks even when the culture went against him. Even when being thrown to the lions, the king respected him. As he was faithful to the King of Kings, the king of Persia was impressed by Daniel. Finally, number 4, how can we be faithful to God in a culture of compliance? We've got very used to seeing our leaders on TV telling us what to do. In the last 6 weeks, that's been great. But let's be very careful about transferring that on. Our leaders have also done some appalling things. Under the cover of COVID, they passed the most extreme abortion law, unusual in the world, that allows full-term abortions in New Zealand. They have also made laws to have a referendum on euthanasia. Euthanasia that would target exactly the same groups of people that we have gone into lockdown to protect. Let us stand against a culture of compliance. Yes, when it's doing the right thing around the virus, fine, but let us question our leaders as well. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's. Well, in summary, as the crisis abates, we also need to reject some of COVID culture. Washing our hands is great, but let's not isolate people. Stay home if you're sick, but let's not allow the virus to feed a plague of loneliness. Let's replace scarcity with generosity. Let's dare to be a Daniel and replace compliance with confrontation, where we challenge what we're told. Let's proclaim hope in Jesus in a time of confusion. Well, let's pray as we finish. Loving God, we thank you for your goodness to us. And we thank you for the things about COVID culture that have protected us in the time of crisis. But now that that is lifting, help us to also step out of COVID culture. Let us look out and visit near our neighbours, our family, our friends. Let us return to a culture of generosity. Let us have an outward spirit, not just an inward one. And let us not just comply, but also confront where we see something that is wrong. May we be your loved people, loving our community. Amen.